short, but they eventually wait for prices to fall further, cutting demand and slowing growth. Beating back the inflation has been a top priority for the Japan government and central bank, especially amid this pandemic. As COVID-19 spread across the world, governments and central banks ponied up trillions of dollars worth of fiscal and monetary stimulus. U.S. President Joe Biden plans to spend $6 trillion, though Congress has only approved a third of that. Some business executives in the U.S. say consumers aren't surprised to see higher prices as rising costs flow through supply chains. Now, others warn the economy could overheat, leading to undesirable inflation. But U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen thinks it will be short-lived and tolerable. Her successor at the Federal Reserve agrees, pointing to transitory factors at work that temporarily pushed up the real rate of inflation in 2021.
The Fed has said they will be patient because they believe it will settle back in over the medium term to something more like a structural path of 2%. We agree with that assessment.
Rising prices in the world's biggest exporter, China, have often had the same inflationary effect on the country's export markets. But now the global recovery, massive fiscal stimulus in the U.S., and soaring costs of shipping and materials are working to increase inflation risks for China, which officials in Beijing regard as imported inflation. China must therefore achieve its growth target of more than 6% for 2021, so the rest of the world can also continue to grow, thereby having a greater chance of boosting employment and economic output with enough inflation to keep runaway demand in check. Now let's dive deeper with Curtis Chin, Senior Asia Fellow at the Milken Institute. Hi Curtis, now you know the markets and the Fed, they seem to be in different camps when it comes to inflation. The Fed says this is short-lived, we shouldn't get too worried. What do you think? Do you think this is temporary?
Who can predict? Of course, to say today, I'm still more in the camp of the Fed that this is stressful. Clearly, as economies recover, and in the United States, the economy is clearly recovering, we expect an increase in inflation. But as your report noted, the levels that people are seeing are really the highest in several years. But again, I think when we focus on what is going forward, we also need to think through about the impact of inflation at two different levels. One on, quite frankly, those that can afford it, but also in this time of what I call a K-shaped recovery, the poorest and those most in need. So as we think through steps forward, at least here in the United States, it's something that our Fed clearly needs to watch. I don't think we should be overly worried at this point. But clearly we'll know a little bit more tomorrow when some of the consumer price, the inflation numbers come out actually tomorrow morning here in the United States.
Yeah, but the Fed is in quite a tight spot so far. On one hand, we saw that dismal employment data last week, so people still need to find jobs, people need to get back to work. And on the other hand, you're seeing these signs of inflation and prices going up. So what can the Fed do to help employment, help the recovery without making or helping the economy go overheated?
Well, clearly that's what they're trying to do right now. Clearly when you look at our U.S. Congress here in the United States, we still live in a divided nation. I would hope that both sides, Republicans and Democrats, can come together and for an economic package that tries to achieve that very delicate balance. And remember, we're not out of the woods yet by any means when it comes to the pandemic. As we talk about inflation, let's remember that this economic recovery isn't necessarily one that we can count on for months going forward. We have to get this pandemic under control.
And as the U.S. is seeing an uneven recovery, to say it, a K-shaped recovery, here in Asia, any inflation in the U.S. could impact us as well. Any change in the Fed's policy could affect Asian economies. So how do you think Asia stands and what impact would this have on Asian economies?
Well, I think Asia right now is looking for stability from the United States. And so they probably already priced in as they're thinking about things going forward, that things will remain the same, at least for this next month, these next 2 months. And remember when we talk about Asia, the diversity of our region of Asia, Japan still struggles to get that elusive 2%. But when Japan talks about inflation, I think what's important to remember is that a little bit of inflation is good. Remember how it impacts real people is that if you think prices are going up, you might purchase some things, you might make some just a transitory moment in time when it comes to inflation.
Though commodity prices are going up, as we heard, I guess, earlier, shipping rates are up as well. But there are some countries here in Asia, especially in the developing world, that can't quite afford higher prices yet. You're looking at the fire spread in India and its neighbor. So what's the outlook for emerging developing Asia?
Mr. Jack, before I got on, I looked at some of the numbers. Clearly India has some relatively high figures. I think it was something like 5%, which I did. But remember, I think as we talked about inflation, we need to understand the importance of addressing that pandemic. And so when you look at India and what is going on, so sadly there, and I think the focus would be a little bit of the wrong direction if we're saying all attention needs to be focused on the issue of inflation versus getting the pandemic under control. In the long term, when we talk about economic growth, economic prosperity, it's going to rely first and foremost on controlling this pandemic.
What should we hear from policymakers then in the near term, Curtis?
Well, here in the United States, which I can speak as to, my hope is that policymakers from both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrats, can come together to get a package done. And what that might well mean, and this might help also address the inflation issue, it might well be a smaller package than President Biden now wishes. I think your report talked about $6 trillion. Maybe a third has been approved last year. And maybe we need to focus some of this investment in our economy versus simply going for these bigger and bigger numbers, which again, on the surface will sound great to consumers, thinking, wow, more money is going to flow. But that excess money may well drive inflation that we're talking about today. So policymakers, again, particularly here in the United States, have to focus on that balance, and that means actually getting something done. I'm always Mr. Optimist, when I come on your show. And so my hope is that is what will happen. The policymakers will see the wisdom of indeed what has, long been, I feel, kind of dismissed, which is that middle road that need to come together to balance out both sides of these issues.
Yeah, we'll continue to keep our eye on that. Curtis Chin, their Senior Asia Fellow at the Milken Institute. Now up next, Japan steps up precedents for the Tokyo Olympics under the shadow of a state of emergency. Plus, more good news on the vaccine front. England's public health agency finds the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine lowers risk of death by 80%.
Insights on the green recovery plan that could change our future.
Asia has been leading global growth for a while, but in order for this to continue in a sustainable way, there has to be a bottoms-up and top-down approach. The companies here in Asia need to get on the ball in terms of doing practices that are seen as sustainable so that investment can really flow to them.
I think the biggest thing that people need to realize is that they can make a difference. And they can do that in a number of ways. They can do it through
unacceptable escalation. While we urge de-escalation on all sides, we also recognize Israel's legitimate right to defend itself, to defend its people and its territory.
U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken added to the condemnation, telling the Palestinians to immediately stop firing rockets from Gaza at Jerusalem. The White House also expressed serious concerns about the worsening troubles, saying it's monitoring the situation closely.
Simon Knox tells us what options are open to Washington to help ease the mounting tensions.
What worries policymakers here, both inside the Biden administration and outside it, is the centrality of the focus of the last 24 hours and the clashes in Jerusalem on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, that third most holy site for Muslims around the world, a tinderbox. Some call the fact that so much attention is now being focused on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. It has always inspired passions on both sides of the divide in the Middle East, and that's why there is concern that this is going to be a difficult situation to damp down. The United States, of course, solid allies of the Israeli government, but at the White House, President Biden's press secretary Jen Psaki today was attempting to demonstrate even-handedness.
In a call over the weekend with his Israeli counterpart, our National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated concerns about the potential evictions of Palestinian families from their homes. And they agreed that the launching of rocket attacks and incendiary balloons from Gaza towards Israel is unacceptable and must be condemned. So this is something that our national security team is closely monitoring. Obviously, across government, certainly the president is kept abreast and is watching closely as well.
But the Biden administration knows that, like U.S. governments before it, it's constrained in terms of any influence that it can hope to have over the Hamas movement, because Hamas is designated by the United States government as a terrorist organization. And they're also very aware that this is all coming at a perilous moment politically in Israel, with competing parties, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the opposition leader Yair Lapid now trying, both of them, to form governments after the election in Israel gave rise to no clear majority.
All right, let's unpack the situation with Professor Doug Waxman, Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Chair in Israel Studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. Thank you for your time today, Professor. Hundreds hurt in clashes outside the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The UN Security Council holding an urgent meeting yesterday, but so far no statement released. The U.S. saying they believe a statement would be counterproductive. So talks ongoing on that front today. But in the meantime, do you expect the violence to escalate?
Well, I think there is, it's already spreading. I mean, this is happening now. Day after day, there's been escalating violence. Hamas's involvement has really upped the ante even further. So whether it's going to escalate still further, I think partly depends on what Hamas does next. Do they respond to the events that have taken place in the Gaza Strip today by launching more attacks in Israel? Or do they pull back from the brink? I think that's going to be one of the key factors to look at, as well as the protests that have been developing as I speak in Israel right now, in Arab towns and cities around Israel, which are also escalating, which is also a very worrying new development in this crisis.
Right, and Netanyahu has also said that a red line was crossed. It sounds like, rhetoric-wise, it's a difficult thing to walk back. In the context of the political stalemate in Israel, does that influence whether both sides, the Israelis or the Palestinians, can find some form of middle ground?
Well, part of the problem is that Israel hasn't really had an effective functioning government for many months now. And although Prime Minister Netanyahu is clearly dealing with this crisis, he isn't being preoccupied with his own legal and political survival. So the Israeli government isn't functioning as it should be. The Israeli police in particular have taken actions which have really exacerbated the situation. And of course, Hamas is operating on its own. The United States has no direct diplomacy with Hamas. And I'm sure the Israelis, through intermediaries, are sending messages residents of East Jerusalem who have been protesting night after night in the streets around the old city of Jerusalem and now on the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, as well as far-right Israeli Jews who have also been protesting and carrying out violent attacks against Palestinians. So there's only so much that governments can do to control this kind of violence, which has really been driven in many ways by individuals and groups on the ground.
Professor, Israel, a major ally of the United States, but President Biden has shown signs that his administration really wants to focus more on immediate, direct threats to the U.S. and actually step away from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. President Biden has made statements on the situation in Jerusalem right now, but some say he needs to do more. According to you, what role do you think the U.S. can and should play?
Well, I think the United States should have done a lot more sooner. They're certainly responding now that this crisis has escalated and rockets now have been fired from Gaza to Israel. But this was a crisis that's been brewing for weeks now. There's been escalated violence taking place in Jerusalem and really very little, very mild American response. I think that's partly a function, as you said, of the fact that the Biden administration is preoccupied with other things. I should note that the US doesn't even have an ambassador to Israel. The Biden administration haven't yet appointed an ambassador to Israel. And this is a real reminder to President Biden and members of his administration, if he needed one, that you can't ignore the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even if you'd like to focus on other crises at home, issues at home, crises and issues around the world. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict will keep on returning to the headlines, and the Biden administration needs to pay attention and not just wait to be reactive when a crisis happens, but to be really proactive to try to prevent the circumstances from developing that create these crises in the first place.
As you say, we need to see a Biden administration that's more proactive, but how optimistic are you that concrete steps will be taken towards a future peace deal, and how the U.S. is going to broker a process like that?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not at all optimistic. I think the Biden administration has made it clear that they don't see any prospect for resumption of the peace process in the near term. It's certainly not on their list of priorities. And even if they were to try to, maybe after this latest round of violence, to resurrect the peace process, there's very little chance that it might succeed, at least as long as Netanyahu remains in power, which may just be a matter of days now, and when President Abbas also remains in power. So I think the most one can expect really is kind of crisis diplomacy to try to prevent an escalation or continuation of violence. But unfortunately, I think the international community and the United States need to do a lot more about addressing the long-running issues in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem in particular, that have fueled this latest outbreak of violence.
Let's look at where we are right now, Professor. Ramadan comes to a close this week. The case of 6 families facing eviction from East Jerusalem, that's still in the courts, and Israeli security chiefs have increased police presence throughout Jerusalem and the West Bank. Is a Palestinian mass uprising unavoidable given the current climate?